Robin, thank you very much. It's nice to be back at the same venue. A little less sunshine than last year, but we're a month earlier in the year. So, just a few words of welcome first. Welcome to those who were here last year, and I hope you will remember, as I do, a strikingly excellent, high-quality, interesting debate, which is why I was delighted to come again this year. And to the newcomers, well, I hope we will deliver something comparably good in the next day and a half. When we met last year, we were just a few months into the energy crisis triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I know we have a NATO meeting taking place downstairs today, so, this is the new world. What are some of the things that have happened since then? Well, European households and European industry have survived, so far, the energy crisis experience, not painlessly. Perhaps grateful to mild weather this winter, and certainly there's been some reduced running of industry. And we've had a deepening of cooperation on energy between businesses and government. We've had to have that in order to figure out how to cope with the crisis. And I think that might be one of the benefits of crisis. You always look for the silver lining, is that many European governments and governments elsewhere in the world have sat down more closely with the businesses of the energy sector than they have, perhaps in many decades, to understand operational needs, some of the judgment calls businesses make, the costs that businesses make calculations about, and to figure out how there can be a way forward in changing circumstances. That's a very good basis for beginning to talk about decarbonisation, which we have been doing, but we all know that the pace and the seriousness of that conversation is rapidly increasing. So I think the key theme today will be lessons about cooperation between government and business and understanding one another. And yes, also the environmental civil society movement, the NGOs, etc., as Robin mentioned, and that's a world I've worked in too. The energy crisis isn't over. Let's see what this next winter brings. But there have been some other developments, and I'd like to highlight two just to frame our conversations today before we get into the first panel. One of them is in terms of the climate agenda. So there's been the publication by the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, of the AR6 synthesis report. This really brings together the state of the art of our understanding of climate science, of what we are doing to Earth system physics, in a very understandable way. There are some fabulous infographics this time. Climate scientists are learning to communicate. And there are some key messages there. The reason there is the push to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees is that is broadly an adaptable degree of change. Once you start to go beyond that, you are an increasingly unadaptable world. We're already seeing increasing natural events associated with climate change, but those rapidly, exponentially increase as you go much beyond 1.5 degrees. So the underlying message is there is no business as usual. Either we adjust, decarbonise, and the other greenhouse gas emissions, or the world around us changes. Business as usual doesn't exist. And that's a challenging message. Linked to it, there's the question of, will we make 1.5 degrees? Now, the scale of action that would be required, the speed of action is, everybody uses the word unprecedented, it really is unprecedented. But I think I like best the reaction of an eminent climate scientist, Corinne Le Quéré, when questioned about this, and The Economist's front page going into the Sharm el-Sheikh COP meeting last November. She said, okay, if it's not 1.5 degrees, it's 1.51. And if it's not 1.51, it's 1.52, because every decimal is going to count. It's not 1.5, so let it become 2. Okay. Another key message that comes out of the IPCC is about half of the mitigation actions that we need to take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions come in at under $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So they're pretty economic. Half don't. Half of them are over that threshold, and therefore the business model challenge, the investment challenge, is enormous. One more thing on climate. I was reading the conclusions from the G7 summit in Sapporo in Japan, and these are perhaps not quite what I expected. I'll quote very briefly. "We're facing an unprecedented triple global crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution that are mutually reinforcing. Therefore, we need immediate, short, and medium-term action in this critical decade. Urgent, enhanced action at all levels, across all sectors, to achieve transformation to net zero, circular, and nature-positive economies." That's government text, shared by Japan. It's not quite what Extinction Rebellion would have written, but it's not so very far away. So everybody's on the same page about the mission. The next thing that's happened, of course, is, and linked to this, is we've seen governments moving in the direction of what we might call green industrial strategies. So we've had the US Inflation Reduction Act and the associated parts of that package. We've had the European Union response with the Net Zero Industry Act. The EU doesn't do acts, so the A is flattery as imitation for the US, and the package that goes with that. And of course, in the UK, we've got the Net Zero Growth Plan and its package. All of those will help drive forward investment in clean technologies. They're slightly different approaches. I think in Europe, we're a little envious of the simplicity of the US tax credits, which create a very clear business model signal. And there are certainly some very attractive things about the IRA, and I suspect we will discuss some of those today. For me, what stands out is the sliding scale. So take hydrogen. If you produce any kind of hydrogen, there's a tax credit. It's a modest tax credit, but you're doing something, you're creating hydrogen supply, and that's one of the challenges at the moment. If you produce renewable electrolytic hydrogen, there's a much more significant tax credit. You've done something more valuable, bigger tax credit. And if you have apprenticeships and are building up a workforce on top of it, there's the maximum tax credit. So that sliding scale and the focus on building up a workforce are very enviable. But there are things we can do here in Europe and the UK as well. Maybe we can't do simplicity, not great at it, but really businesses would say, if we can't have simplicity, then let's have stability, let's have predictability of the policy framework, regardless of whether there are changes of government. And let's also sort out some of our own regulations. I was speaking on this topic in Brussels last week and learned that if you are a certified geothermal technician in Sweden, you can't work in Germany. These are things we can sort out because we have a single market, we have workforces, and perhaps we could do that, hypothesize, beyond just the EU scale around Europe if we're serious about the pace of change that we're looking at. So another theme is getting the policy kit right, and that takes us back to businesses and governments listening to one another, understanding one another's worries, understanding how to build confidence for investors, and thinking about some of the signals that need to go into the market. And I'll leave you with a comment from Pascal Lamy, former European Commissioner, former head of the WTO. I was sitting at a round table with him recently, and he said, we need to bring both force and scale into our market designs if we are to deliver on what we need to do. So what is the ask from the business sector about force and scale from government? And certainly one of my reasons to be here for the next day and a half is to listen to you and take away messages about that. So with that short opening, I hope, thank you very much. And may I invite our panelists for the first panel, Joachim and Miguel, to come up and join me. You will recognize these gentlemen from last year. We had such fun in the first panel last year that we thought, let's meet again, please.